The streets of New York in the early 20th century were alive with chaos, a pulsing undercurrent of ambition, fear, and survival. Tenement buildings leaned precariously over narrow alleys, their brick walls scarred with the graffiti of immigrant life and the harsh imprint of poverty. Children played in the shadow of looming factories, their laughter mingling with the clatter of streetcars and the cries of vendors hawking their wares. But beneath this bustling surface lay another world, one invisible to most, where power was measured not in wealth alone, but in fear, loyalty, and the ability to command obedience with a single glance. This was the world into which Charles Lucky Luciano was born, a world that would shape him and ultimately be reshaped by him. From the outset, Luciano's life was framed by struggle. His family, like thousands of others, had crossed the Atlantic seeking opportunity and refuge from the crushing poverty of Sicily. Yet the promise of the New World was bitterly contrasted by the reality of Lower East Side life, where disease, hunger, and violence were constant companions. Young Luciano learned early that survival required cunning, a quick temper, and an instinct for reading people. In these streets, every encounter was a test, every smile a potential trap, every handshake a transaction weighed in unspoken currency. It was here, in the crucible of New York's immigrant neighborhoods, that the foundations of his character were laid, ambition tempered by pragmatism, ruthlessness hidden behind charm, and an unquenchable hunger for power. The city itself seemed to conspire with destiny. The smoke-stained skyline, the ceaseless hum of industry, and the endless tide of people arriving at Ellis Island created a pressure cooker of opportunity and desperation. Gangs roamed the streets, claiming corners and tenements as their own, a fragmented web of violence and territoriality. Law enforcement was often ineffective, corrupt, or both, leaving space for those willing to grasp it with both hands. Into this environment stepped Luciano, small in stature but formidable in presence, moving with a calculated confidence that belied his years. He observed, he listened, and he learned, absorbing lessons from the street hustlers, pickpockets, and small-time thugs who populated the neighborhood. Each fight, each narrow escape, each minor victory was a brick in the foundation of a mind that was slowly constructing an empire. By the 1920s, the world was changing. Prohibition had turned ordinary citizens into conspirators overnight, and the illicit liquor trade became the proving ground for those with ambition and nerve. Speakeasies flourished, rivers and docks hummed with clandestine shipments, and gangsters became the new captains of commerce, wielding influence that stretched far beyond the dimly lit streets. Luciano watched, studied, and strategized. While others relied on brute force and impulsive violence, he began to think in terms of networks, alliances, and long-term planning. He understood that power was not simply about intimidation. It was about control, perception, and the subtle art of negotiation. And he was determined to master it all. But Luciano's rise would not come without a human cost. In the shadow of every triumph lurked betrayal, and in the wake of every deal, enemies waited patiently, their grudges slow to fester but merciless in execution. The streets that had once nurtured his ambitions were the same streets where rivals would seek to test him, challenge him, and ultimately attempt to unseat him. It was a world in which trust was a currency rarer than gold, where a handshake could conceal a dagger, and where loyalty was often fleeting. And yet, this volatile environment was the proving ground of Luciano's genius. He learned to read intentions as easily as expressions, to manipulate situations to his advantage, and to convert chaos into opportunity. As the narrative of his life begins to unfold, it becomes clear that Lucky Luciano was more than just a product of his environment. He was an architect of it, a visionary capable of seeing possibilities where others saw only survival. He would rise above the petty rivalries and street-level violence that ensnared so many of his contemporaries, forging alliances across ethnic and criminal lines and constructing a new order that combined ruthlessness with efficiency. He was a man who understood the psychology of fear and respect, the subtle balance of loyalty and coercion, and the power of a reputation carefully curated. By the time he emerged into the public eye, he was no longer merely a street kid from the Lower East Side. He was a symbol, a figure whose influence would reverberate far beyond the alleyways of New York, shaping the very nature of organized crime for generations to come. In this opening chapter of history, the city itself feels like a character, both adversary and accomplice. The smoke-choked air, the creaking tenements, the constant buzz of commerce and crime, all reflect the tension and opportunity that define Luciano's world. It is in this crucible that the legend is born, where chance encounters and calculated risks converge to shape a man who would not only survive the streets but ultimately bend them to his will. And so the story begins, a story of ambition, cunning, and transformation, set against the backdrop of a city that never sleeps, never forgives and never forgets. Before Lucky Luciano rose to power, the criminal world of New York was fragmented, chaotic and dangerously inefficient. The city's underworld was a patchwork of ethnic gangs, each claiming its own turf with a mixture of violence and bravado, yet lacking any overarching organization or vision. Italian, Irish, Jewish and other immigrant groups coexisted uneasily, their relationships defined by temporary alliances, grudges and territorial disputes. Every street corner, every speakeasy, and every dock could spark conflict, as the hungry and the desperate competed not only for survival but for dominance. Law enforcement often seemed a distant, impotent force, more interested in bureaucratic procedure than in curbing the relentless tide of organized crime, and the police themselves were frequently bribed, threatened, or manipulated, further blurring the line between order and chaos. In this turbulent world, power was a fluid and fragile commodity. Gangs were led by figures who relied primarily on brute strength, intimidation, and fear. Their reigns were short-lived, punctuated by violent clashes, police raids, and betrayal from within. Decisions were reactive rather than strategic, with leaders constantly fighting to maintain control of a landscape that seemed designed to devour them. Turf wars erupted over gambling dens, bootlegging routes, and even seemingly minor businesses like butcher shops or bakeries, as every street was considered a potential source of income and influence. The streets themselves were alive with a kind of perverse energy, a constant battle for survival, where trust was scarce and the margin for error was almost non-existent. The early 1900s saw a particular surge in criminal activity, fueled by the massive influx of immigrants seeking opportunity in America. These newcomers often found themselves isolated, impoverished, and discriminated against, which created fertile ground for organized crime to thrive. Neighborhood gangs became surrogate families, offering protection, identity, and opportunity, albeit with strict rules and violent enforcement. Young men were drawn into this world not only by necessity but by the intoxicating promise of power and status. Yet, despite their ambition and audacity, these early mob figures lacked the cohesion and foresight that would later define Luciano's empire. Their operations were fragmented, their rivalries personal and vendetta-driven, and their vision rarely extended beyond the immediate gratification of money or territory. At the same time, the United States was entering a period of social and economic upheaval. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, created a sudden and unprecedented demand for illegal alcohol, transforming petty criminals into powerful players almost overnight. However, even this boom did not immediately favor anyone with strategic acumen. The illicit liquor trade was dominated by gangs who relied on force rather than organization. Violent confrontations were commonplace, and the streets were littered with the corpses of those who miscalculated, betrayed allies, or simply failed to defend their claims. Corruption was rampant. Politicians, police, and even judges could be bought, but only those with insight, patience, and boldness could navigate this treacherous environment successfully. For most, the underworld remained a short-term game of survival, not a long-term enterprise. It was in this fractured landscape that Lucky Luciano would later see opportunity where others saw chaos. The underworld of his time was a place of wasted potential, where ambition was often undercut by impulsive violence or short-sighted decisions. Whereas the gangs were like scattered storm clouds, Luciano would later envision an organized, controlled system, where influence was consolidated, profits maximized, and violence calculated rather than reckless. But before that transformation could occur, the underworld had to be understood in all its raw, brutal complexity. Every murder, every betrayal, every raid on a speakeasy carried lessons. Lessons about human nature, trust, loyalty, and fear. Luciano absorbed these lessons with an intensity that set him apart from his peers. Even as the city teetered on the edge of disorder, there were glimpses of potential for structure. Small alliances formed between gangs, often driven by necessity rather than strategy. Temporary truces were brokered to protect mutual interests or to fend off police crackdowns. The very instability of these relationships, however, highlighted the enormous gap between power and control. In the minds of most gang leaders, the idea of a unified system, capable of managing multiple operations across boroughs, borders, and ethnic lines, was unthinkable. They were trapped in cycles of retaliation, short-sighted ambition, and territorial obsession. This was the world into which Luciano would step, one of fear, fragmentation, and endless opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. Understanding the pre-Luciano underworld is essential to appreciating the magnitude of his later achievements. The streets were dangerous, lawless, and often deadly, Yet they also served as a proving ground for the young man from the Lower East Side, a world that taught him lessons no classroom ever could. The chaos, the violence, the fleeting loyalties, and the constant threats all combined to forge a mind capable of seeing patterns and possibilities that others missed. Where others saw only fractured gangs and senseless bloodshed, Luciano saw a system waiting to be engineered, a network waiting to be commanded. By the time Luciano began to move through these streets as a rising figure, he had already internalized the rules of survival, the value of alliances, and the utility of fear. He understood that power could be wielded not just through violence, but through organization, strategy, and psychological mastery. And while the gangs of the pre-Luciano era were short-sighted and impulsive, they were also the very environment that allowed him to sharpen his instincts, refine his tactics, and ultimately envision a future in which crime was no longer merely a matter of chaos, but a business to be run with precision, calculation, and ruthless efficiency. Charles Lucky Luciano's rise from the crowded streets of the Lower East Side was neither accidental nor purely a product of circumstance. It was the result of a rare combination of intelligence, ambition, and an instinct for survival that few could match. Born into a world of poverty and struggle, he navigated the harsh realities of immigrant life with a mixture of street smarts and calculated risk-taking. The Lower East Side in the early 1900s was a labyrinth of narrow streets, packed tenements, and bustling marketplaces, teeming with families desperate to survive. Children like Luciano were raised in an environment where every day was a lesson in resilience. Food was scarce, work was grueling, and danger lurked around every corner. Yet within this crucible of hardship, Luciano learned the unspoken rules of the streets: how to assess a threat, read the intentions of others, and manipulate situations to his advantage. From a young age, he was drawn to the energy of the streets, the unspoken networks of influence and power that operated in the shadows. He watched older boys carve out small territories, control gambling dens, and command respect through a mix of charm, wit, and menace. To the untrained eye, it may have appeared as mere delinquency, but to Luciano, it was a lesson in hierarchy, loyalty, and human behavior. He saw patterns where others saw chaos and understood that survival depended not just on strength, but on cunning, timing, and psychological insight. Every fight he engaged in, every minor theft, every narrow escape from the authorities became a brick in the foundation of a mind that would later redefine organized crime. Education, in the traditional sense, offered little for a boy like Luciano. Schools were overcrowded, underfunded, and often dangerous, with violence spilling into classrooms from the streets outside. Yet he absorbed lessons in other ways, learning through observation and experience. He watched how men negotiated deals, intimidated rivals, and maintained loyalty among their followers. He understood the subtle power dynamics in play when a word, a look, or a gesture could shift the balance of authority. While other children of his age were dreaming of conventional success, Luciano's ambitions were being forged in the fires of a city that rewarded cunning over innocence, strategy over naivety, and daring over compliance. By his teenage years, Luciano had begun to test the limits of his environment. He engaged in small-scale theft, pickpocketing, and street-level hustles, building a reputation as both daring and clever. His peers and even older gang members started to notice a young man who could read situations with unusual acuity, someone who knew when to fight and when to withdraw, when to threaten and when to charm. While many in the Lower East Side were trapped in cycles of petty crime and fleeting violence, Luciano began to see beyond survival. He envisioned a trajectory that went far beyond the block, the neighborhood, or the immediate spoils of a successful heist. He was thinking in terms of influence, control, and the long game, concepts that would later define his rise. Luciano's early alliances were crucial to his development. He gravitated toward mentors and figures within the Italian-American underworld who recognized his potential. These relationships were both instructional and transactional, providing opportunities to learn about the hierarchy, codes of conduct, and the mechanics of organized crime. At the same time, they offered him a glimpse of the rewards, wealth, respect, and power that could be achieved through careful calculation and strategic maneuvering. He observed how older gangsters managed men, negotiated with rivals, and handled law enforcement, internalizing lessons that would later allow him to operate on an unprecedented scale. Yet it was not merely ambition or cunning that propelled him forward. It was also his psychological adaptability. Luciano possessed an uncanny ability to read people, to understand their desires, fears, and weaknesses, and to exploit them subtly. This skill allowed him to navigate complex social and criminal networks with finesse, building loyalty where others would only inspire fear, and undermining rivals with precision rather than brute force alone. He recognized that fear could open doors, but respect and trust could build empires. This duality would become a hallmark of his leadership style, a balance between intimidation and influence that allowed him to dominate the underworld without alienating the very men he relied upon. The formative years of his rise were also marked by exposure to violence and betrayal. In the streets of New York, loyalty was fragile and often transactional. Friends could become enemies in a heartbeat, and rivals were relentless in their pursuit of power. Each skirmish, each act of treachery, provided Luciano with hard-earned lessons about the fragility of alliances, the importance of timing, and the need for strategic foresight. These experiences hardened him, refined his instincts, and shaped a mentality capable of both calculated ruthlessness and visionary planning. By the time he reached adulthood, Luciano had already distinguished himself from his peers. He was no longer simply a street-level operator. He was a strategist, a man capable of seeing the broader patterns within the chaos. While others were focused on immediate gains or petty revenge, he was thinking in terms of networks, leverage, and long-term influence. He recognized that the future of crime in New York would belong not to those who relied solely on violence, but to those who could combine intelligence, psychological insight, and organizational acumen. It was this combination of street-honed skills, ambition, and psychological insight that set Luciano on the path to power. The Lower East Side, with all its hardships and dangers, had served as a training ground, a proving arena where he could test his wits, refine his instincts, and understand the human calculus of fear, respect, and loyalty. From these streets, he emerged not just as a survivor, but as a visionary, a man ready to exploit the chaotic, fragmented world of organized crime and transform it into a calculated, far-reaching enterprise. In this environment, the seeds of his future empire were sown, and the legend of Lucky Luciano began to take root, a story that would redefine power, loyalty, and the very structure of the criminal underworld for decades to come. The streets of New York had taught Luciano much, but the real lessons began when he stepped into the shadowed world of the mafia itself. It was a world of codes and hierarchies, where loyalty was demanded, respect was earned, and betrayal was often met with lethal consequences. For a young man like Luciano, the mafia represented both opportunity and peril, a place where his street-honed skills could be amplified, yet any misstep could mean death. His initiation into this clandestine society was not merely ceremonial. It was a test of character, intelligence, and psychological acuity. It was here that Luciano learned the subtle art of power, the unspoken rules that governed relationships, and the mechanisms of influence that would define his future empire. Luciano's early encounters with seasoned mobsters were formative. He observed their methods with a keen, analytical eye, absorbing both their strengths and weaknesses. He noted how older men maintained control over their crews, how fear was wielded as a tool, and how trust was carefully rationed. Violence was not random but calculated, deployed strategically to assert dominance or settle disputes. Conversations carried hidden meanings, gestures communicated warnings, and even the smallest favors were measured in potential leverage. To survive and thrive in this world, Luciano had to learn quickly to read between the lines, to anticipate reactions, and to act decisively when opportunity presented itself. The initiation itself was as much symbolic as practical. It marked his entry into a world bound by a strict moral and operational code. The rituals, whispered among shadows, conveyed the gravity of the allegiance he was pledging. He was being bound not just to a family, but to an entire system of power that demanded obedience, cunning, and unwavering discretion. Every handshake, every oath, every glance carried weight. Failure to adhere to these unspoken rules could result in immediate punishment, and the memory of such consequences hung over him like a constant shadow. For Luciano, the initiation was less a moment of fear and more a moment of awakening, a recognition that he was now part of a complex game that extended far beyond street-level skirmishes. One of the most critical lessons he absorbed during these early days was the importance of observation and patience. Many young initiates made the mistake of rushing to assert themselves, relying on raw aggression to make their mark. Luciano understood that true influence was cultivated through subtlety, strategy, and timing. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to watch more than he acted, and to calculate risks with precision. He saw that reputation was more powerful than muscle alone, that perception often dictated reality, and that a carefully timed decision could yield far more than impulsive violence. His ability to internalize these lessons marked him as a figure destined for leadership. Mentorship played a pivotal role in this phase of his development. Older mobsters, recognizing his intelligence and ambition, allowed him access to the inner workings of operations, sharing knowledge about territory management, revenue streams, and the balancing of alliances. Luciano absorbed these lessons eagerly, but he also refined them, thinking in terms of networks rather than isolated operations. Where his mentors saw localized control, he began to envision a system capable of connecting multiple crews, managing conflicts, and maximizing profits while minimizing exposure. He was learning not only to survive but to restructure the very environment in which he operated. Yet the path was fraught with danger. Rival factions, jealous associates, and unpredictable violence were constant threats. Luciano quickly realized that the mafia, despite its rigid codes, was a world of fluid loyalties and calculated betrayal. He learned to weigh every relationship carefully, identifying allies whose interests aligned with his own and enemies whose ambition threatened his ascent. The psychological aspect of leadership became apparent. A successful mobster had to inspire loyalty, command fear, and manipulate perceptions simultaneously. This duality, blending intimidation with influence, became the foundation of Luciano's approach to power. During these formative years, Luciano also discovered the economic dimension of organized crime. The mafia was not merely a collection of thugs and enforcers. It was a sophisticated enterprise with its own rules of finance, negotiation, and resource allocation. Profits from gambling, extortion, and smuggling were carefully managed, and loyalty was often incentivized through strategic reward rather than mere coercion. Luciano recognized that understanding the economics of crime was as critical as mastering its physical and psychological demands. He observed how seasoned mobsters negotiated deals with corrupt officials, exploited loopholes, and controlled illicit markets, internalizing lessons that would later allow him to elevate organized crime to unprecedented levels of efficiency. By the end of his initiation period, Luciano had transformed from a streetwise hustler into a strategic thinker, capable of navigating the complex social, economic, and psychological landscapes of the mafia. He understood that leadership required more than muscle. It required vision, intelligence, and adaptability. Violence alone was insufficient. It had to be tempered by calculation, diplomacy, and an acute awareness of human behavior. The streets of New York had taught him survival, but the mafia taught him mastery, the ability to command loyalty, anticipate threats, and manipulate outcomes in a world where one misstep could be fatal. Luciano's initiation into the mafia marked the beginning of his ascent toward unprecedented power. It was a period in which he honed his instincts, cultivated relationships, and learned to view the criminal world through a lens of organization and strategy. The lessons he absorbed in this phase were the foundation for the empire he would later build, an empire that would redefine organized crime in America and establish him as one of the most influential figures in the history of the underworld. In these shadowed rooms, whispered conversations, and tense confrontations, Luciano discovered the rules of the game, and more importantly, how to bend them to his advantage. Luciano quickly realized that surviving in the mafia required more than brute force. It demanded the careful cultivation of alliances, the strategic selection of friends, and a deep understanding of when to negotiate and when to dominate. From the moment he entered the organization, he recognized the importance of relationships as currency. Every handshake, every introduction, every favor carried weight, and each interaction had the potential to tip the balance of power. Unlike many of his peers who relied solely on intimidation or short-term loyalty, Luciano approached his world with a meticulous, almost surgical mindset. He understood that influence was not merely seized, it was built, nurtured, and leveraged with precision. In the beginning, Luciano moved cautiously, aligning himself with figures whose interests aligned with his own and observing those who held sway over key operations. He identified mentors, competitors, and potential allies, always calculating the long-term implications of every connection. He recognized that in a world driven by fear and ambition, loyalty was often transactional, and the ability to anticipate shifts in allegiance could mean the difference between survival and elimination. For Luciano, relationships were never static. They were dynamic tools, instruments of strategy that could be used to consolidate power, manipulate rivals, or create openings for advancement. As he navigated this complex network, Luciano demonstrated an uncanny ability to balance charm with intimidation. He could win over skeptics with his wit and intelligence, yet simultaneously instill a quiet but unmistakable sense of authority. He learned that fear could command obedience, but respect ensured longevity. Where many mobsters relied on sheer force or terror to maintain control, Luciano built his influence through a combination of strategic partnerships, subtle manipulation, and the careful orchestration of events behind the scenes. His ability to read people, understanding their ambitions, weaknesses, and desires, became one of his most powerful tools. One of his earliest strategies involved bridging gaps between rival factions. The New York underworld was fractured, divided along ethnic lines and personal vendettas. Italian gangs operated in relative isolation, Irish crews controlled different territories, and Jewish gangs dominated certain markets. Each faction viewed the others with suspicion, and conflicts erupted regularly, often spilling into public violence that threatened the stability of all parties involved. Luciano saw opportunity in this chaos. By forming strategic alliances, he could create a network that transcended ethnic boundaries and personal grudges, uniting disparate elements under his vision of a more organized, profitable criminal enterprise. This required diplomacy, patience, and a keen sense of timing. Luciano often positioned himself as a mediator, someone capable of negotiating truces or agreements that benefited all parties. Yet behind every handshake was a careful assessment of loyalty and potential threat. He tested allegiances subtly, observing how individuals reacted under pressure, gauging their reliability, and identifying the limits of their ambition. In this way, alliances were not static. They were carefully constructed frameworks that could be adjusted as circumstances evolved. By the time he consolidated his first significant network, Luciano had already demonstrated a mastery of the social architecture of crime, a skill that would define his career. Luciano also understood the importance of investing in people, rewarding loyalty with tangible benefits and ensuring that his allies had a vested interest in his success. Money, protection, and opportunities were distributed not haphazardly, but strategically, reinforcing bonds of allegiance and creating interdependence. He recognized that a crew was only as strong as the trust and loyalty that bound it together, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that his men understood their place within the larger framework of power. Unlike leaders who relied solely on fear, Luciano cultivated a culture in which loyalty was reinforced both by respect and by mutual gain, creating a more stable and effective organization. At the same time, he remained acutely aware of the dangers inherent in these alliances. Betrayal was constant, and ambition was a double-edged sword. Even those closest to him could turn into rivals if given the right opportunity or provocation. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to anticipate these risks, to identify potential threats before they could manifest, and to neutralize them without unnecessary disruption to the broader network. His approach was measured, deliberate, and ruthless when necessary, ensuring that every move strengthened his position while minimizing exposure to danger. The process of building influence extended beyond the mafia itself. Luciano recognized the value of connections with politicians, law enforcement, and business figures who could be persuaded or coerced into supporting his objectives. These external alliances provided protection, opportunities for expansion, and access to resources that would have been impossible to secure through criminal channels alone. By integrating these elements into his network, Luciano transformed the notion of power from something localized and reactive to something systemic and far-reaching. His influence became multidimensional, spanning not just the streets but the broader socio-political landscape of New York. By the end of this period, Luciano had solidified a reputation that set him apart from his peers. He was no longer simply a promising young gangster. He was a strategist, a negotiator, and a builder of alliances capable of reshaping the underworld itself. Through a combination of charm, intelligence, foresight, and calculated risk, he had begun to construct the foundation of an empire. The networks he established, the alliances he forged, and the reputation he cultivated became the cornerstone of a new approach to organized crime, one that emphasized structure, interdependence, and long-term vision over impulsive violence and fragmented authority. This phase of Luciano's rise highlights the essential truth of his leadership. Power was never given. It was constructed, carefully measured, and strategically deployed. Each alliance, each relationship, and each calculated act of influence brought him closer to a level of control that few in the history of organized crime had ever achieved. By the time he moved beyond these initial steps, Luciano was poised not just to participate in the mafia but to redefine it entirely, creating a system that would endure for decades and set the standard for modern organized crime. As Luciano's network of alliances solidified, his vision began to extend beyond mere survival and street-level dominance. He started to see the potential for a new kind of criminal enterprise, one that operated not on impulsive violence or localized influence, but on strategy, organization, and profit. The chaotic, fragmented underworld that had nurtured him was no longer sufficient. He envisioned a system in which every operation, every crew, and every territory could function as part of a coordinated whole. To him, crime was not a collection of sporadic acts, it was a business, and the principles that govern legitimate enterprise could be adapted to maximize efficiency, revenue, and control. Luciano's first step in this transformation was the careful consolidation of power. He understood that the mafia, in its existing state, was prone to internal conflict and inefficiency. Gangs operated in isolation, with overlapping territories and competing interests that frequently erupted into violence. Luciano sought to centralize authority without provoking rebellion, using diplomacy and strategic alliances to create a hierarchy that ensured clear lines of command and accountability. He recognized that a stable system required loyalty, enforcement, and the careful balancing of ambition among his subordinates. Each decision was deliberate, calculated to minimize risk while increasing long-term gain. This approach extended to the management of resources and revenue streams. Luciano meticulously studied the economic landscape of criminal enterprise, identifying opportunities where profit could be maximized through innovation and organization. Gambling dens, illicit liquor distribution, and labor racketeering were not merely sources of cash. They were interconnected systems that, if managed strategically, could generate unprecedented wealth and influence. Luciano applied principles akin to corporate management, delegating responsibilities to trusted lieutenants, instituting oversight mechanisms, and ensuring that revenue was tracked and reinvested to strengthen the overall enterprise. Where others saw chaos and opportunity, he saw structure, potential, and leverage. One of Luciano's most significant innovations was the concept of collaboration over conflict. He recognized that prolonged turf wars drained resources, endangered lives, and threatened stability. By negotiating truces and coordinating operations across formerly hostile factions, he created a system in which multiple crews could operate profitably without constant confrontation. This required not only diplomacy but psychological insight, as he had to ensure that alliances were maintained through respect, fear, and mutual interest. Luciano's ability to manipulate both ambition and loyalty allowed him to craft a network in which power was shared strategically, yet controlled centrally, a precursor to the modern syndicate model. The organizational restructuring extended to the hierarchy itself. Luciano implemented a system in which authority flowed logically, responsibilities were clearly defined, and accountability was enforced through both reward and discipline. Lieutenants and captains were given autonomy within their spheres but were required to adhere to overarching directives that protected the interests of the larger organization. This balance of autonomy and oversight ensured efficiency while maintaining control, and it minimized the chaos that had plagued earlier criminal networks. Violence was used sparingly and strategically, not recklessly, ensuring that disputes could be managed without threatening the overall enterprise. Luciano also demonstrated a remarkable understanding of the intersection between crime and society. He recognized that influence extended beyond the criminal world into politics, law enforcement, and legitimate business. By cultivating relationships with corrupt officials, sympathetic politicians, and compliant law enforcement officers, he created a protective buffer that allowed his operations to thrive with reduced interference. This was not simply about bribery, it was about crafting a system of influence that integrated multiple spheres of power, ensuring that his enterprise could operate with both discretion and reach. He understood that true control required more than fear. It required structural leverage and the ability to manipulate external systems to his advantage. Innovation became a hallmark of Luciano's leadership. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied on traditional criminal methods, he experimented with new approaches to enforcement, revenue generation, and risk management. He introduced systematic oversight of operations, tracking profits, losses, and personnel performance. He created mechanisms for conflict resolution that minimized disruption while maintaining authority. He leveraged information strategically, understanding that knowledge of both allies and rivals could be as valuable as money or muscle. Through these innovations, Luciano transformed organized crime from a loose collection of gangs into a disciplined enterprise capable of sustained growth and unprecedented influence. The psychological component of his leadership was equally critical. Luciano understood that fear alone could not sustain loyalty. Respect, incentives, and perception were equally essential. He cultivated a personal brand of authority, one that combined charisma, intelligence, and calculated ruthlessness. He demonstrated both the capacity for mercy and the willingness to act decisively, creating an aura of unpredictability that kept allies aligned and rivals cautious. In this way, he exercised influence not only through direct control but through perception management, ensuring that his reputation reinforced the structural advantages he had built. By the late 1920s, Luciano's vision was taking tangible form. He had begun to centralize operations, coordinate previously independent crews, and implement systems that optimized both efficiency and profitability. The chaotic underworld that had existed for decades was gradually being replaced by a network that operated with precision, discipline, and strategic foresight. Every decision, every alliance, and every operation was guided by an understanding that crime could be managed like a business, that violence could be deployed strategically rather than impulsively, and that influence could extend beyond the streets into the broader social and political landscape. This transformation was not without resistance. Rivals and traditionalists within the mafia viewed Luciano's methods as threatening, sometimes arrogant, and occasionally dangerous. Some resisted the shift from brute force domination to strategic organization, seeing his approach as overly intellectual or manipulative. Yet Luciano's skill in negotiation, alliance building, and psychological insight allowed him to overcome these challenges, neutralizing opposition while simultaneously expanding his influence. By combining force, diplomacy, and strategy, he created a model that few could contest, establishing himself as the architect of a new era in organized crime. Ultimately, this period marked Luciano's transformation from a streetwise operator into a visionary strategist. He was no longer reacting to chaos. He was shaping it, bending it to his will, and orchestrating operations on a scale previously unimaginable in the criminal world. His emphasis on organization, strategy, and innovation laid the groundwork for the syndicate model that would dominate organized crime for decades, blending ambition, intelligence, and ruthlessness into a form of power that was both disciplined and adaptive. In this phase of his career, Luciano did not merely seek control. He redefined what control could look like, creating a blueprint for modern crime that combined business acumen, psychological mastery, and calculated authority in a way that transformed the underworld forever. Central to the power and cohesion of Luciano's burgeoning empire was the Code of Omerta, a moral and psychological framework that governed every action, dictated loyalty, and instilled fear. Omerta was more than a set of rules. It was a philosophy, a way of life that demanded silence, obedience, and unwavering allegiance. In a world where betrayal could mean instant death, this code served as both shield and sword, ensuring that the inner workings of the organization remained invisible to outsiders while keeping internal hierarchies intact. For Luciano, understanding and mastering Omerta was essential, not only as a means of self-preservation, but as the foundation for building a disciplined, efficient, and far-reaching enterprise. From the outset, the Code of Omerta reinforced the brutal logic of loyalty. Members were bound not by friendship or personal sentiment alone, but by a combination of fear, respect, and self-interest. Any violation of trust, whether through revealing secrets, colluding with law enforcement, or undermining leadership, was met with swift and decisive consequences. Luciano recognized that fear alone could enforce compliance, but without mutual respect and the careful distribution of power, such fear would breed resentment and rebellion. He refined the application of Omerta, blending it with incentives and strategic reward systems that encouraged loyalty while reinforcing the invisible bonds that held the organization together. Omerta also shaped the psychological landscape of the mafia. Every member internalized the constant tension between trust and suspicion, knowing that their words, actions, and alliances could be scrutinized and judged at any moment. This created a heightened state of awareness, a relentless attention to detail, and an understanding of human behavior that few outsiders could fathom. Luciano's genius lay in exploiting this dynamic. He cultivated loyalty not simply through coercion, but by demonstrating intelligence, fairness, and the ability to reward initiative. Members of his network understood that allegiance brought tangible benefits, yet disloyalty was a risk with lethal consequences. This duality of fear and incentive became a cornerstone of his leadership, allowing him to command respect while minimizing internal instability. The moral dimension of Omerta was equally significant. It was not merely about secrecy, it was about identity, belonging, and the projection of strength. The code demanded that members live by its principles in every sphere of life, creating a culture in which obedience was internalized and betrayal was almost unthinkable. Luciano understood that the perception of integrity within the organization was as important as the enforcement of rules. A man who adhered to Omerta projected authority, reliability, and dominance. A breach, even minor, could ripple outward, undermining credibility and destabilizing alliances. By enforcing this code with consistency, Luciano established a framework in which the mafia operated as a disciplined, cohesive entity rather than a loose collection of violent factions. Fear, when wielded effectively, became a tool of psychological control. Luciano's understanding of human behavior allowed him to calibrate intimidation, ensuring it was measured and strategic rather than arbitrary. Violence was never random. It was used to reinforce the principles of omerta, to signal boundaries and to demonstrate consequences. This approach created an environment in which members internalized the rules, and even those who harbored ambition or resentment understood the cost of transgression. Fear, carefully applied, became both a motivator and a stabilizer, enhancing the cohesion of the organization and deterring rivals from testing its limits. Yet Luciano also recognized that loyalty could not be enforced through fear alone. Respect, opportunity, and shared benefit were essential components of allegiance. He rewarded initiative, protected trusted subordinates, and offered avenues for advancement within the organization. By intertwining fear with reward, he transformed the rigid requirements of omerta into a living, dynamic system in which loyalty was both demanded and nurtured. Members came to see their commitment not merely as obligation, but as a rational choice aligned with their personal survival and ambition. In this way, the code became a mechanism for both discipline and motivation, creating a psychological ecosystem in which the organization could thrive. The code of omerta also extended beyond internal operations to interactions with outsiders. Members were expected to maintain silence in the face of law enforcement, rivals, or the press, ensuring that the organization's activities remained hidden and protected. Luciano leveraged this principle to insulate his operations from investigation, knowing that the reliability of his network depended on a combination of discipline, secrecy, and trust. By instilling a culture in which silence was absolute and loyalty non-negotiable, he created an organization resilient to external pressures, capable of operating with both efficiency and secrecy in a hostile environment. The enforcement of omerta was strategic, often subtle. Luciano understood that public displays of punishment could inspire fear but also draw unwanted attention. He preferred calculated measures, private reminders of consequence, and the careful management of internal disputes. Through this approach, he maintained control without creating chaos or eroding the loyalty that was essential for stability. His mastery of omerta demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both human psychology and organizational dynamics, highlighting his ability to blend moral authority, fear, and strategic discipline into a coherent system of power. Ultimately, the Code of Omerta was more than a set of rules. It was the backbone of Luciano's empire. It allowed him to impose order on a chaotic world, manage complex human relationships, and enforce loyalty across a sprawling network of crews and operations. It was the framework through which he could exercise power, control risk, and ensure the survival of both himself and the organization. In mastering this code, Luciano not only protected himself from internal and external threats but also created a model of disciplined, psychologically sophisticated leadership that would define modern organized crime. The psychological weight of omerta, combined with Luciano's strategic insight, elevated him above mere street-level ambition. He understood that the human mind was as much a battlefield as the streets themselves, and that control over perception, loyalty, and fear could shape outcomes as decisively as any weapon. By intertwining moral philosophy with practical enforcement, he forged an organization in which obedience was automatic, loyalty was calculated, and betrayal was unthinkable. It was this nuanced understanding of human behavior, institutionalized through omerta, that allowed Luciano to transform the mafia from a loose collection of violent gangs into a disciplined, resilient, and efficient empire capable of sustaining power over decades. With the framework of loyalty and fear firmly established, Luciano turned his attention to the most crucial element of any empire, the business of crime. For him, organized crime was never about random acts of violence or petty opportunism. It was an enterprise, a network of revenue streams to be cultivated, protected, and optimized. Gambling, smuggling, bootlegging, and labor racketeering were not simply sources of cash. They were the arteries through which power flowed, the mechanisms by which influence could be expanded and sustained. Luciano approached these enterprises with a precision that mirrored legitimate business practices, applying strategy, delegation, and oversight to transform chaos into profit. The gambling operations he oversaw were meticulous and wide-ranging. Underground casinos, poker rooms, and betting parlors were organized not as isolated ventures but as interconnected enterprises, each feeding into a broader network that maximized revenue while minimizing exposure. Every location had managers, enforcers, and accountants, roles that ensured efficiency, security, and loyalty. Luciano implemented oversight systems to monitor earnings, detect embezzlement, and enforce discipline. He recognized that the profitability of these operations depended not merely on chance but on control, strategy, and the ability to anticipate and mitigate risk. By professionalizing these ventures, he elevated them from chaotic street-level operations into predictable, highly lucrative enterprises. Bootlegging and smuggling, particularly during Prohibition, became the crown jewel of Luciano's criminal portfolio. He understood that the illicit liquor trade was not just a path to wealth, but a pathway to influence. Controlling the supply of alcohol allowed him to manipulate prices, dictate distribution networks, and secure loyalty from both suppliers and buyers. Luciano coordinated shipments from docks to speakeasies with the precision of a corporate supply chain, using trusted lieutenants to manage logistics and enforce compliance. He ensured that operations were insulated from law enforcement through a combination of bribery, corruption, and careful discretion, demonstrating that control over information was as critical as control over territory. Labor racketeering offered yet another avenue of influence. By infiltrating unions and exploiting organized labor, Luciano was able to generate revenue, manipulate industries, and expand his reach beyond the traditional criminal underworld. Union leaders, often sympathetic to or intimidated by his influence, allowed him to dictate contracts, extract kickbacks, and control key industries from shipping and construction to entertainment. This manipulation of legitimate systems amplified his power, giving him leverage over businesses, politicians, and other criminal factions. Through these operations, Luciano demonstrated an understanding that modern crime was as much about systems and influence as it was about direct action, and that control over institutions could be more profitable and enduring than control over streets alone. The psychological sophistication of these enterprises cannot be overstated. Luciano recognized that human behavior was the key to maintaining control. Employees, lieutenants, and collaborators were motivated through a careful balance of fear, reward, and prestige. Competence and loyalty were rewarded. Disloyalty and failure were punished decisively, often privately to maintain cohesion and morale. By creating a culture in which ambition could be directed and harnessed rather than suppressed, he ensured that his organization could scale while maintaining internal discipline. Every member understood their role, their responsibilities, and the consequences of deviation, which created both stability and efficiency. Rival gangs and competitors posed constant threats to these operations, but Luciano's approach was methodical. Rather than relying solely on violence to eliminate threats, he combined negotiation, alliance building, and strategic intimidation to neutralize opposition. By forming temporary partnerships or brokering truces, he could redirect conflicts into productive avenues, often turning potential adversaries into collaborators. This approach minimized disruption while maximizing control, demonstrating his capacity to manage both people and enterprise simultaneously. The result was a criminal network that was not only expansive but resilient, capable of weathering challenges that would have dismantled less sophisticated organizations. Luciano's empire was also distinguished by its adaptability. He understood that criminal markets were dynamic, influenced by changing laws, economic conditions, and social trends. Prohibition, for example, created a surge in demand for alcohol that could be exploited by those with vision, while shifts in labor law and policing required flexibility and strategy. Luciano's operations were designed to respond to these changes, with contingency plans, diversified revenue streams, and a decentralized command structure that allowed for rapid decision-making. By anticipating the shifting landscape, he ensured that his empire could endure both internal rivalries and external pressures. The interplay between legality and criminality was another area in which Luciano excelled. He recognized that the most profitable enterprises often existed at the intersection of legitimate and illicit activity. By leveraging relationships with businessmen, politicians, and law enforcement, he was able to integrate his operations into the wider social and economic fabric of New York. Casinos could operate under the guise of legitimate entertainment, unions could be manipulated to extract influence, and bootlegging operations could be masked by complex distribution networks. This ability to blur the line between legal and illegal ventures amplified both profitability and strategic leverage, demonstrating that the true genius of his empire lay not merely in revenue, but in systemic control. As the 1930s progressed, Luciano's criminal network became a highly efficient, multi-layered operation, with overlapping spheres of influence that reinforced each other. Each revenue stream supported the others, and each alliance strengthened his position. The careful orchestration of these activities transformed him from a powerful figure within a single faction to a central authority in a sprawling criminal ecosystem. His empire was no longer just a collection of profitable ventures. It was a living, adaptive machine, sustained by discipline, psychological insight, and strategic foresight. By the end of this period, Luciano had not only amassed wealth but also unparalleled influence. He controlled industries, unions, and territories. He manipulated allies and rivals alike, and he had demonstrated the capacity to combine ambition, intelligence, and ruthlessness into an operational model that was both sustainable and scalable. The business of crime, once chaotic and fragmented, had been transformed under his guidance into an organized, profitable, and resilient system. Luciano had proven that criminal enterprise, when approached with vision, strategy, and psychological acumen, could rival legitimate business in sophistication and reach, setting the standard for modern organized crime for generations to come. As Luciano's empire flourished, the veneer of control and stability concealed a simmering undercurrent of rivalry, betrayal, and hidden war. Power in the underworld was never absolute. It was a delicate balance of ambition, loyalty, and intimidation. Every alliance carried the potential for treachery, and every victory planted the seeds of future conflict. While Luciano had mastered the art of organization, the very structure that gave him strength also created tension among those who chafed under his rising influence. Rivals watched his ascent with suspicion, allies tested the limits of loyalty, and enemies plotted in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. The underworld was not a peaceful hierarchy. It was a battlefield where fortunes, lives, and reputations could change in an instant. The hidden war was psychological as much as it was physical. Luciano understood that brute force alone could not secure dominance. It required manipulation, perception management, and the careful orchestration of events to maintain control. He observed rivals closely, analyzing their patterns, motivations, and vulnerabilities. Any misstep could be fatal, and information was power. Luciano cultivated a network of informants, confidants, and spies, ensuring he remained several steps ahead of both friends and foes. In this environment, loyalty was constantly tested, and the ability to anticipate betrayal became as crucial as the ability to wield a weapon. Rival mobsters, some of whom had been old allies, grew increasingly wary of Luciano's influence. His systematic restructuring of the underworld, his ability to coordinate formerly hostile factions, and his control over lucrative enterprises threatened the established balance of power. These men could not openly challenge him without risking war, yet they could not simply accept his dominance either. Instead, they maneuvered covertly, seeking opportunities to undermine his operations or turn his allies against him. This invisible struggle, fought through intimidation, strategic sabotage, and secret alliances, defined the hidden war that raged beneath the surface of Luciano's apparent success. Allies too became a source of tension. Luciano's ability to reward loyalty and enforce discipline created dependence, but it also bred envy and ambition. Men who had once been loyal now questioned the distribution of power, the balance of rewards, and the limits of their own authority. Some attempted subtle rebellions, testing the boundaries of obedience, while others engaged in clandestine negotiations with rival factions. For Luciano, this required constant vigilance, psychological insight, and decisive action. He could not afford to allow even minor disloyalties to fester, as they could escalate into full-scale betrayal. The hidden war demanded not just strategy but relentless attention to the human element, the ever-shifting motivations, desires, and fears of those around him. The stakes were amplified by the encroachment of law enforcement and government oversight. Prohibition had made organized crime both profitable and highly visible, attracting scrutiny from authorities determined to dismantle illicit networks. Luciano faced a dual threat: rival gangsters who sought to exploit any vulnerability, and officials who aimed to impose legal constraints. To navigate this landscape, he relied on both subtle manipulation and strategic alliances. Bribes, influence, and intimidation were deployed to neutralize legal threats, while internal discipline ensured that his network remained resilient in the face of scrutiny. Every move was a calculation, every relationship a potential lever of power or vulnerability. Betrayal became an ever-present danger. Some rivals attempted to infiltrate his operations, others sought to exploit lapses in loyalty, and a few even considered assassination. Luciano responded not with rash violence, but with precision, using intelligence, foresight, and psychological leverage to neutralize threats. Informants within enemy factions were turned into allies, suspicious subordinates were tested and reinforced, and potential acts of rebellion were either absorbed or eliminated discreetly. In this way, Luciano managed the hidden war with a combination of subtlety, ruthlessness, and strategy, ensuring that his empire could endure while his rivals faltered. The hidden war also shaped Luciano's reputation. To his allies, he became a figure of awe and authority, a man capable of commanding loyalty while anticipating treachery. To his enemies, he was a force of inevitability, an adversary whose intelligence, ruthlessness, and foresight made opposition dangerous. This dual perception was a deliberate aspect of his strategy. By cultivating both respect and fear, he maintained leverage over those within his organization and those outside it. Reputation in Luciano's world was as much a weapon as cash, guns, or influence, and he wielded it with careful precision. During this period, key events tested Luciano's ability to maintain control. Disputes over territory, competition for revenue streams, and challenges to his authority required decisive action. He negotiated truces, orchestrated strategic removals, and reinforced loyalty through both incentives and subtle intimidation. These maneuvers were not always visible to outsiders, creating the sense of a seamless, stable empire, while beneath the surface, battles for power, trust, and influence raged continuously. Luciano's genius was in his ability to manage these conflicts without destabilizing the broader network, preserving both profitability and authority even in the midst of constant threats. The hidden war extended beyond physical confrontations and alliances. It was also fought through perception, rumor, and manipulation. Luciano understood that information and the control of narrative could be as powerful as any action. He orchestrated events to project strength, conceal vulnerability, and influence the decisions of both allies and enemies. By shaping perception, he was able to deter challenges, reinforce loyalty, and create a sense of inevitability regarding his dominance. In this way, the hidden war was as much a battle of minds as it was a struggle for territory or money. By the end of this period, Luciano had demonstrated an unparalleled ability to navigate complexity. He maintained cohesion within his organization, neutralized threats before they became crises, and expanded his influence despite the constant undercurrent of rivalry and betrayal. The hidden war had tested every facet of his leadership, strategic thinking, psychological insight, and decisiveness, but he had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more respected than ever. It was a testament to his genius that even amid chaos, his empire continued to grow, his authority remained unchallenged, and his network of influence extended deeper and wider than any rival could hope to achieve. Despite Luciano's meticulous planning, strategic foresight, and unparalleled ability to command loyalty, the foundations of his empire were not immune to the relentless scrutiny of law enforcement. By the early 1930s, his expansive operations had attracted intense attention from federal authorities, local police, and political figures determined to dismantle organized crime. The very structure that had allowed him to consolidate power, the centralized network of alliances, the profitable enterprises, and the extensive influence over unions and gambling, made him a visible target. Where once secrecy and the Code of Omerta had shielded him, now the weight of evidence, witness testimony, and the persistent machinery of the law began to close in, signaling the beginning of a dramatic turning point in his life. Luciano's arrest was a carefully orchestrated maneuver by prosecutors who recognized the threat he posed. Authorities aimed to strike not just at him, but at the model of organized crime he had perfected. The charges, ranging from violations of the Mann Act to bootlegging, extortion, and conspiracy, were meticulously compiled, reflecting years of investigation. Each allegation was not merely a legal formality but a strategic move to dismantle the empire he had built. As news of his impending trial spread, the tension in the underworld intensified. Rivals sensed opportunity, allies questioned loyalty, and the fragile equilibrium he had maintained for years began to waver. For Luciano, the arrest was a confrontation not only with law enforcement but with the vulnerabilities inherent in even the most sophisticated criminal empire. The courtroom became a stage for both legal and psychological warfare. Luciano, always conscious of perception and influence, understood that the trial was about more than facts, it was about narrative. The media framed him as the archetypal gangster, a figure of fear and fascination whose personal story captivated the public. Journalists sensationalized his exploits, emphasizing violence, ambition, and audacity, while prosecutors leveraged public outrage to strengthen their case. Luciano faced the dual challenge of defending his actions in a legal arena while managing the perceptions of a nation hungry for scandal. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, was a maneuver in a complex game in which the stakes extended far beyond personal liberty. During the trial, betrayals within his own ranks became evident. Former allies, seeking reduced sentences or personal advantage, provided testimony that threatened to unravel the networks he had spent years constructing. The fragility of loyalty in the underworld was laid bare, and the human element, the ambitions, fears, and self-interest of those around him, proved as formidable a challenge as any legal argument. Luciano confronted the reality that, no matter how disciplined or sophisticated his organization, human nature remained unpredictable, and the same mechanisms of loyalty that had sustained him could also facilitate his downfall. The courtroom drama was punctuated by moments that revealed the tension between fear and respect, power and vulnerability. Witnesses recounted acts of violence, extortion and manipulation, painting a portrait of a man who had transformed organized crime into a structured, profitable enterprise. Luciano, calm and composed, navigated these proceedings with the same strategic mindset that had guided his empire. He knew when to assert authority, when to remain silent, and how to project control even under the relentless pressure of legal scrutiny. Yet despite his composure, the weight of accumulated charges, betrayal and public exposure created cracks in even the most formidable facade. Sentencing marked the dramatic turning point of his public life. Luciano was convicted, his empire officially under legal siege, and his personal liberty drastically curtailed. The sentence symbolized not just the failure of the individual to evade justice, but the vulnerabilities inherent in the very model of power he had created. The empire, while still intact in its operations, faced uncertainty as leadership shifted, alliances wavered, and rivals sought to capitalize on perceived weakness. The legal apparatus had succeeded in destabilizing what had once seemed invincible, demonstrating that even the most disciplined, strategic and psychologically astute criminal could be challenged when subjected to the combined forces of law, politics and public scrutiny. Yet even in the face of conviction, Luciano's influence persisted. The empire he had constructed was resilient, its systems of loyalty and discipline strong enough to survive his personal setbacks. Orders continued to flow, operations maintained profitability, and alliances adapted to protect the interests of the organization. This period revealed the genius of Luciano's leadership. He had designed an enterprise that could endure beyond his immediate presence, a testament to his understanding of organizational structure, human psychology, and systemic control. His personal fall did not equate to the collapse of his vision. The mechanisms he had established allowed the enterprise to persist and adapt, even under intense pressure. The trial also underscored the psychological dimensions of power and vulnerability. Public fascination with Luciano, amplified by sensationalist reporting, reinforced his myth while simultaneously exposing his humanity. The figure that once operated with near-absolute control now faced the scrutiny of judges, juries, and the press. The contrast between the feared don of the streets and the defendant in a courtroom illuminated the complex interplay of perception, authority, and morality. Luciano's life, once defined by dominance and invisibility, now became a spectacle, offering both lessons and warnings about the precariousness of even the most formidable criminal careers. By the conclusion of this period, Luciano had experienced the first significant cracks in his empire. His arrest and trial highlighted vulnerabilities in loyalty, the relentless pressure of law enforcement, and the consequences of visibility in a world predicated on secrecy. Yet even in this moment of apparent vulnerability, he demonstrated resilience, strategic foresight, and an enduring capacity to influence events from both within and beyond the confines of incarceration. The stage was set for the next chapter of his life, a period defined by the challenge of maintaining power under constraint, navigating betrayal, and adapting to a world in which his personal freedom had been curtailed, but his empire remained a living, breathing entity capable of surviving and even thriving despite adversity. Even behind the cold, iron bars of prison, Luciano's influence remained formidable, a testament to the meticulous empire he had built over decades. Confinement, which would have broken most men, became a new battleground for his strategic genius. He quickly recognized that physical separation from his operations did not mean a loss of power. Rather, it was an opportunity to test the resilience of his organizational structure and the loyalty of those who operated in his absence. Letters, coded messages, trusted intermediaries, and carefully orchestrated communications became his tools, allowing him to continue directing operations, managing disputes, and maintaining the intricate network of alliances that had become the backbone of his criminal empire. Luciano's control from prison was not casual or incidental. It was the result of deliberate planning and foresight. Before his incarceration, he had built a hierarchy that functioned almost autonomously, with lieutenants and captains understanding their roles, responsibilities, and boundaries. Each subordinate was aware of the consequences of failure or disloyalty, and the code of omerta ensured that secrecy and discipline were deeply internalized. This structure enabled operations to continue efficiently even when he was physically removed from the scene. While some contemporaries might have struggled to maintain authority behind bars, Luciano's empire adapted, thriving under the framework he had painstakingly constructed. Communication became an art form. Letters and messages were never simple. They were coded, layered with nuance, and often designed to test loyalty as much as transmit instructions. Trusted intermediaries acted as extensions of his will, carrying out directives with precision and reporting back on the state of operations. Luciano's ability to maintain control remotely relied not just on organizational systems, but also on his deep understanding of human psychology. He knew which lieutenants could be trusted with autonomy, which required constant oversight, and how to motivate, manipulate, or subtly threaten to ensure compliance. Even in confinement, his perception of loyalty, ambition, and risk remained razor-sharp. Luciano also leveraged the prison environment itself as a strategic tool. He cultivated relationships with guards, administrators, and fellow inmates who could serve as channels for information, influence, and negotiation. By navigating the power dynamics within the prison system, he ensured that his communication lines remained open and that his authority was respected even by those outside the criminal world. This manipulation of circumstance extended the reach of his influence, demonstrating that power was not defined by location but by intelligence, strategy, and perception. Even while confined, Luciano projected an aura of inevitability, a presence that extended far beyond his physical cell. The ability to manage his empire from behind bars also highlighted Luciano's mastery of perception. Outside the prison walls, rivals and allies alike understood that his incarceration did not diminish his authority. The fear and respect he had cultivated over decades ensured that his directives were followed, disputes resolved according to his design, and operations conducted without disruption. His reputation functioned as a shield as much as a weapon. It protected his interests while reinforcing the notion that opposition was both futile and dangerous. In this way, prison became less a place of punishment than a proving ground for the durability of his empire. Psychologically, this period was as much about resilience as strategy. Luciano's ability to remain mentally engaged, calculating, and influential in an environment designed to limit freedom demonstrated extraordinary focus. He maintained vigilance over every aspect of his operations, monitored potential betrayals, and assessed emerging threats with the same precision that had characterized his rise to power. His mindset during this time underscored a fundamental principle. True leadership is not merely about physical presence, but about the ability to shape outcomes, control perception, and command loyalty across distance and adversity. Even the smallest decisions carried weight. Orders regarding disputes, allocations of resources, and enforcement of discipline were communicated and executed with meticulous care. Luciano ensured that his lieutenants understood the rationale behind each directive, reinforcing the interdependent system of authority that allowed the empire to function seamlessly. These mechanisms were reinforced by incentives and consequences, rewards for loyalty and competence, punishment or removal for betrayal or negligence. In effect, he had created an ecosystem capable of self-regulation, resilience, and adaptation, able to withstand both internal friction and external pressures. Despite the apparent calm of operations, the prison period also exposed vulnerabilities. The removal of a central figure always introduces risk. Rivals could test boundaries, alliances could fray, and law enforcement could exploit internal weaknesses. Luciano anticipated these dangers, responding with preemptive measures and calculated interventions. By maintaining constant awareness and adapting strategies in real time, he minimized the threat of disruption while demonstrating that control could extend far beyond personal liberty. The empire he had created was as much a product of foresight and psychology as it was of money, muscle, and intimidation. Ultimately, Luciano's tenure behind bars reinforced his legend. It was a period in which his strategic genius, organizational foresight, and psychological mastery were tested to their limits, and proven resilient. The empire he had constructed did not merely survive his incarceration. It continued to operate efficiently, expand its influence, and adapt to new challenges. From within his cell, Luciano demonstrated that leadership is defined not by proximity or physical presence, but by vision, strategy, and the ability to command loyalty, inspire fear, and manipulate circumstances to one's advantage. Prison, which might have been the end for lesser figures, became a stage upon which Luciano's brilliance and adaptability were displayed in full, further cementing his status as a master architect of modern organized crime. Luciano's eventual release from prison did not mark a triumphant return to the streets but the beginning of a new, more complex chapter: exile. In 1946, under pressure from political forces and the shifting landscape of organized crime, He was deported from the United States to Italy, a country that was foreign to him in many ways despite his heritage. For a man whose identity and influence had been forged in the streets, back rooms and speakeasies of New York, exile was both a punishment and an existential challenge. It removed him from the physical center of his empire, stripped him of the immediate mechanisms of power, and forced him to confront a world in which influence could no longer be exerted with the same immediacy and certainty. Italy, recovering from the devastation of World War II, was a landscape of both opportunity and uncertainty. Luciano quickly realized that, while his American empire was largely beyond his direct control, his reputation and strategic acumen could still be leveraged to maintain influence. The networks he had established in the United States were resilient, and his allies remained loyal, navigating the complexities of his absence while continuing to manage operations. From abroad, Luciano began orchestrating his empire in a more indirect manner, relying on intermediaries, correspondence, and strategic alliances to extend his reach across the Atlantic. His exile did not end his power, it transformed it into something more abstract, more dependent on perception, negotiation, and influence rather than immediate action. The experience of exile forced Luciano into reflection. Removed from the immediacy of criminal operations, he was confronted with questions of legacy, mortality, and the true cost of ambition. The streets, the violence, and the constant maneuvering that had defined his life were replaced by contemplation and observation. He witnessed the evolution of both organized crime and society itself, noting how the systems he had built in New York had adapted, survived, and even thrived without his direct supervision. This period revealed the enduring power of his strategic innovations, as well as the limitations imposed by physical distance and the inevitability of political interference. Yet exile was not without action. Luciano remained a force to be reckoned with, maneuvering carefully to protect his interests and guide the empire he had created. He cultivated relationships with emerging crime figures in Italy and beyond, subtly exerting influence over new operations while maintaining channels of communication with trusted allies in the United States. His knowledge of both American and European criminal systems gave him a unique perspective, allowing him to anticipate opportunities, mediate disputes, and safeguard the continuity of his empire from afar. Even in exile, Luciano's fingerprints were visible across operations, demonstrating that power could be sustained through strategy, diplomacy, and reputation, even when proximity was lost. This phase of his life also revealed the psychological transformation of the man behind the myth. Luciano, once defined by ruthless ambition and immediate control, began to exhibit the introspection of a figure who had seen both the heights and vulnerabilities of power. He understood the fragility of loyalty, the inevitability of betrayal, and the transient nature of influence in ways that only distance and consequence could teach. Exile became both a constraint and a lens through which he could assess the enduring principles of leadership, organization, and strategy that had enabled his extraordinary rise. The lessons of control, perception, and psychological insight that had guided him in New York now informed a more measured, reflective approach to influence. Despite geographical separation, Luciano's presence loomed large in the underworld. His directives continued to shape operations, his reputation commanded respect, and his strategic vision influenced decisions made thousands of miles away. He had engineered a system in which his absence did not diminish authority, a testament to his foresight and the resilience of the networks he had built. Allies and lieutenants understood the stakes, adhered to the principles he had instilled, and executed his strategy with discipline. Luciano's exile proved that influence was not merely a function of proximity, but of perception, planning, and the disciplined execution of organizational control. The endgame of Luciano's life in exile was also marked by the reconciliation of ambition with mortality. Removed from the immediate dangers and dramas of criminal life, he could observe the broader arc of his influence and consider the meaning of his legacy. Exile allowed him to assess not only the endurance of his empire but the psychological and structural foundations that made it possible. He recognized that the systems of loyalty, fear, and organization that had sustained him were perhaps his most enduring achievement, outlasting the violence, ambition, and chaos that had defined the early stages of his career. Luciano's final years were not defined by spectacular power plays or dramatic confrontations but by the subtle exercise of influence and the navigation of exile. He lived at the intersection of reflection and strategy, watching the empire he had built continue to function, evolve, and adapt without his direct intervention. The exile phase highlighted a profound lesson. True power is not only about presence, action, or immediate control, it is about systems, perception, and the ability to shape outcomes even when physically constrained. Luciano's life in Italy demonstrated that the architecture of influence he had designed could endure the most significant of personal setbacks, cementing his role as a visionary strategist of organized crime. By the end of his exile, Luciano had achieved a form of immortality through his systems, networks, and enduring influence. The man who had once dominated the streets of New York, navigated betrayals, and commanded fear and respect across a sprawling criminal empire now observed the consequences of his actions from a distance. His legacy was no longer solely the product of immediate control or direct intervention. It was the result of structures, relationships, and strategic foresight that outlived his proximity. Exile, intended as a punishment, became a testament to the durability of his genius, reinforcing that his vision for organized crime had transcended the limitations of geography, law, and even personal liberty. Luciano's legacy is perhaps his most enduring and complex achievement. He did not merely build an empire of violence and illicit revenue. He redefined the very structure of organized crime, transforming it into a disciplined, strategic, and psychologically sophisticated enterprise. The methods he pioneered, the centralization of power, the use of intermediaries, the combination of fear and incentive, and the meticulous enforcement of loyalty, set the standard for generations of criminals who would follow. Luciano demonstrated that crime could be approached as a system, an operation to be optimized, managed, and sustained over decades, rather than as a series of isolated, chaotic acts. This vision of organized crime has persisted long beyond his lifetime, influencing criminal networks in ways that are both operational and psychological. His approach to leadership was revolutionary. Luciano understood that the durability of power depended not just on personal strength or charisma, but on the careful structuring of relationships, hierarchies, and incentives. The Code of Omerta, which had governed loyalty and secrecy, became a blueprint for controlling human behavior within the organization. By blending fear, respect, and opportunity, he ensured that members acted in alignment with organizational goals, even in his absence. The psychological insight embedded in his approach allowed the empire to function efficiently, anticipate challenges, and absorb shocks, whether in the form of internal disputes, law enforcement pressure, or rival aggression. In essence, Luciano demonstrated that true power is as much about the architecture of influence as it is about immediate action. Luciano's influence extended beyond the operations of his own empire. He established patterns of organization and control that were adopted by other criminal groups, both in the United States and internationally. His model of centralized coordination, division of labor, and strategic alliance building became a template for syndicates seeking to balance profitability with resilience. Rival factions and emerging leaders studied his methods, learning the value of delegation, perception management, and disciplined enforcement. By transforming the underworld into a networked system rather than a collection of warring factions, Luciano reshaped the rules of engagement, creating an enduring framework for modern organized crime. The impact of his strategies was not limited to profit and survival. It also shaped the psychological landscape of the criminal underworld. Members internalized the principles he enforced, understanding that loyalty, discretion, and competence were rewarded, while betrayal or negligence could be fatal. This psychological conditioning created a culture in which self-interest and organizational alignment were harmonized, producing efficiency, cohesion, and resilience. Luciano's genius lay in his recognition that human behavior was both the greatest vulnerability and the most powerful asset of any criminal enterprise, and he engineered his empire to maximize the benefits of this insight. Luciano also demonstrated an acute understanding of reputation as a tool of power. Throughout his life, he carefully curated the perception of himself as both feared and respected, a man whose influence extended far beyond immediate physical control. This cultivated image allowed him to maintain authority, negotiate alliances, and deter rivals even from a distance. His legacy is therefore both tangible and symbolic. The physical structures, revenue networks, and disciplined operations he built, and the psychological imprint of authority, strategy, and fear that continued to shape the underworld long after his death. Moreover, Luciano's influence highlights the intersection of legality, illegality, and social power. By infiltrating unions, manipulating industries, and cultivating political connections, he demonstrated that control over institutions could be as potent as control over streets. This strategic insight created a dual legacy: the practical mechanics of organized crime and a broader understanding of how influence could be exerted through both formal and informal channels. His methods have left a lasting imprint not only on criminal networks but on the perception of organized crime in society, law enforcement, and popular culture. The enduring fascination with Luciano also speaks to the complexity of his persona. He was simultaneously ruthless and calculated, charismatic and intimidating, human and myth. Historians, criminologists, and popular culture have explored his life as a study in ambition, strategy, and moral ambiguity. The narrative of Luciano is not merely one of violence or crime. It is a story of psychological mastery, organizational innovation, and the relentless pursuit of control in a world governed by both chaos and opportunity. His life forces reflection on the nature of power itself, the interplay of loyalty and betrayal, and the capacity for intellect and strategy to redefine even the most brutal of human enterprises. Luciano's strategies also influenced law enforcement, as authorities were forced to adapt to increasingly sophisticated criminal networks. The frameworks he developed required new investigative methods, undercover operations, and cross-jurisdictional coordination. In many ways, his legacy shaped the evolution of policing and criminal justice, demonstrating that organized crime was not merely a threat to property and life but a systemic challenge requiring strategic understanding, intelligence gathering, and psychological insight. The enduring lessons of his empire thus extend beyond crime itself, influencing the systems designed to combat it. In reflecting on Luciano's legacy, one must also consider the duality of his impact. He left a blueprint for power that was extraordinarily effective, yet it was rooted in violence, coercion, and the exploitation of human vulnerability. His genius cannot be separated from the moral cost of his operations, the lives disrupted, and the institutions corrupted by his influence. Yet it is precisely this combination of brilliance and moral ambiguity that renders his story compelling. A man who mastered the psychology of power, engineered complex systems of influence, and redefined an entire era of organized crime. Ultimately, Luciano's legacy is one of enduring influence. He transformed organized crime into a disciplined, strategic, and resilient enterprise, created psychological and structural frameworks that ensured loyalty and compliance, and demonstrated the power of perception, strategy, and foresight in shaping both human behavior and systemic outcomes. His life continues to resonate as a study in ambition, intellect, and the complex interplay of morality, power, and human psychology, a story whose lessons extend far beyond the streets he once dominated, into the realms of strategy, leadership, and the understanding of influence itself. As the years passed, Luciano's exile in Italy became a strange mixture of isolation and reluctant influence. He was far from the streets that once echoed his commands, separated from the concrete world where his power had been carved through fire, loyalty, and blood. Yet even oceans could not fully extinguish the shadow he cast. Men still whispered his name in New York alleys and in Havana's smoky backrooms, recalling the era when one man orchestrated the pulse of an entire underworld. But time, unyielding and unforgiving, continued its slow erosion. The world evolved, new players emerged, and the empire he had once shaped with iron precision drifted into the hands of those with different visions and different loyalties. In Italy, Luciano lived under constant surveillance, watched by governments who feared what a single whisper from him might ignite. But the truth was more tragic than dangerous. He was no longer the man authorities imagined. The roar that once defined him had softened into something quieter, something more reflective. He spent his days walking the narrow streets of Naples, observing the bustle of a city that reminded him of the world he once dominated, yet remained entirely out of reach. The cafes, the markets, the voices, everything felt familiar but none of it belonged to him. It was as if he were living in the echo of a life already concluded, a visitor to a past that no longer recognized him. Despite the fading influence, he still met with old associates, listening more than directing, offering wisdom rather than orders. These conversations were fragments of the world he had lost, reminders that the legacy he built had not disappeared, only transformed. Some still sought his approval, hoping to draw strength from the legend. Others came only out of respect, honoring the man who had once rewritten the structure of organized crime. Yet Luciano understood what they did not say. He knew that the syndicate had grown beyond him, shifting with each new generation. His era had closed, and he stood at the edge of history watching from the outside. But it was in those quiet hours alone, late at night, that the weight of his life pressed hardest. There were moments when memories replayed with brutal clarity, the alliances, betrayals, triumphs, and the long chain of consequences he carried like an invisible scar. He thought of the friends he had buried, the enemies he had outlived, and the choices that had shaped him into both a myth and a cautionary tale. Regret didn't often pierce his hardened exterior, yet flashes of it emerged when he considered what the relentless pursuit of power had cost him. Freedom. Belonging. A place to return to. In the end, the silence around him grew louder than any courtroom verdict, any exile decree, any threat from rivals. The world no longer feared him, no longer needed him, no longer revolved around his decisions. What remained was the man stripped of the empire that once defined him, confronting the truth that even legends must eventually fade. And as he continued his solitary walk through foreign streets, Luciano understood that this, more than prison, more than deportation, was his final sentence: to witness his own legacy become history, and to exist as a ghost in the world he helped create.